Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Dozier. I am the Wilder School's new Director of Development and Alumni Engagement. Thank you all for joining us for the September edition of the Wilder School Lunch and Learn series titled Eviction Across the Commonwealth, What You Need to Know. Next, I want to introduce Dean Susan Gooden to get us started by sharing a few brief remarks. Dean Gooden.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I greatly appreciate great to see everyone. And I want to give a warm welcome to you, Stephen, for joining us at the Wilder School. For those who do not know or haven't had the opportunity to meet Stephen, he is our new Director of Development and Alumni Engagement. He comes to us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we look forward and are excited to welcome him to the Wilder School family. Today's Alumni Lunch and Learn, as Stephen mentioned, will focus on a very timely topic, which is evictions. I know it's going to be an excellent session. For those who have not joined this event before, the Wilder School Alumni Lunch and Learn is an event that we started during the pandemic as a way to bring focus on contemporary topics, and we have had overwhelming support. We plan to continue this, even though VCU, like many other universities, has returned largely to in-person learning. And we're very excited about that and our increased presence on campus. We are also going to hold on to some of the things that worked well during the pandemic, and our Lunch and Learn series is one of those. So we look forward to continuing to host programming each month and invite you to continue to join us. I would like to say briefly a bit of good news about the Wilder School and to share some with you. We continue to be proud of our rankings from U.S. News and World Report. We are tied for the #1 ranked school in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we're very excited about the excellence that we're able to offer across all of our academic disciplines, including our rankings in the areas of social policy, urban policy, and public management and leadership. I'd also like to invite you to join us for our Wilder School Symposium next week, which will also be a virtual event. This is an event that Governor Wilder hosts each year. And the topic for next week's event is going to be the triple pandemic, implications for racial equity and public policy. This is based on a forthcoming book volume that will be authored by several Wilder School faculty and will include a foreword from Governor Wilder. So if you haven't registered, we've got the RSVP link here, and we'll also put it in the chat. And we encourage you to join us next Thursday for what promises to be another exciting event. And then also, I wanted to take this time to encourage you to nominate an excellent Virginian to receive our Excellence in Virginia Government Awards. You will see the categories that are there before you. This is a signature event of the Wilder School. We are able to recognize and issue an award to Virginians who have done all kinds of great work, whether it's the Unsung Hero Award or the Lifetime Achievement Award. So again, you will see that link. Those nominations are being accepted through November the 1st. So please reach out and nominate an individual or an organization in these categories. It promises to be another outstanding year. And then finally, I want to encourage you to join our newsletter series, which is called Policy Bites. Many of you may already be receiving this, but this is a very concise roundup of news that really is focused on areas that policymakers in Virginia are engaged around. It provides a summation of some of our research activities and implications for contemporary public policy. You can sign up for this newsletter at wilderschool@vcu.edu if you haven't already done so. And then finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs, Jill Gordon, who is going to be moderating today's session. Jill is also a professor in her own right in our criminal justice program, where she specializes in community and institutional corrections. Jill.
Thank you, Dean Gooden. Hello and welcome to everybody who's joined us today to learn more about this important topic of eviction. I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kathryn Howell. She is an associate professor in the Urban and Regional Planning program here in the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. Dr. Howell also serves as the co-director of the RVA Eviction Lab with her colleague, Ben Teresa. Prior to pursuing her Ph.D. in Community and Regional Planning at the University of Texas, Dr. Howell worked in state and local government positions in Maryland and Washington, D.C., where she focused on affordable housing preservation and inclusionary zoning. She sustained and expanded this line of work through her research investigating the physical and cultural displacement within the context of preserving affordable housing, seeking to identify and reduce barriers among government actors, advocates, and community members. She has recently published a book that is partially titled Affordable Housing Preservation in Washington, D.C. In this book, she focuses on ways tenants can be centered in policies and practices that keep housing costs reasonable as cities change. She continues to work with advocates, organizers, and policymakers in the region on affordable housing preservation policy creation. In addition, her work has been recognized by her peers locally, regionally, and nationally as exemplified through awards received from the Journal of Urban Affairs, the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association, and VCU's Council for Community Engagement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kate Howell.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak to you today. I've been looking forward to this, and it's something that we think is really important, both I think at the Wilder School and definitely within the lab. We find it's really important to make sure that our work is out there and in the public. So I'm going to start briefly talking about kind of why we formed, because the lab, because it's a bit of a level setting, right? If you haven't been kind of engaged in housing conversations, you may have heard a little bit about eviction, and right now eviction is very important, but the groundwork really started in Virginia and even obviously in Richmond well before this time. So Ben, Teresa, and I are full-time faculty members here at the Wilder School in planning, and we had been, as part of that work, we had been partnering with community organizations, advocacy groups, other nonprofits across the state and both within the region on issues of housing. And so we were kind of working with them already. And in 2018, the New York Times came out with an article that was pretty surprising for some folks. Other folks on this call were completely unsurprised. And that was that Virginia had 5 of the top highest evicting cities in the country. And Richmond, in fact, was number 2. And that really jogged people a little bit to say, wow, there's something going on here. And it was very mobilizing. And we were partnering with organizations. They pulled us in to do analysis, and we were sort of doing ad hoc work for community groups such as the Campaign to Reduce Evictions. But we realized very quickly that we needed more consistent and long-term data if we were going to really put a dent in housing instability across the Commonwealth. So we formed in the fall of 2018 and have really been doing a range of analysis. We kind of see our goals focusing on both kind of large scale policy work through state legislature and others, but also we work directly with service providers who are using our data to target eviction prevention work. We are also working with very community-based organizations who are trying to do direct work to stop evictions and keep folks in their homes. So we did a range of things, some short briefs, research briefs, maybe related to education, race in the Commonwealth, which I'll talk about in a moment, and as well as kind of some of these infographics that gave an overview for particularly elected officials who were kind of curious about what was going on in their districts, as well as advocates who wanted to be able to tell elected officials what was going on in their districts. So we went sort of back at the start of the pandemic. We came in with significant knowledge, but we came in with a significant challenge as well. And so I want to kind of give a sense of where we started when the pandemic starts. And so this is just kind of an overview of jurisdictions across the Commonwealth with eviction rates greater than 5.1%. And this is unlawful detainers. So just to be very clear, I know that's always the question folks ask, what do you mean by an eviction? Well, we know that unlawful detainers, which is not unlawful detainers, these are the eviction judgments. We know that the judgments are kind of sit in the middle of when people move, right? Many people move when they get that first notification from their landlord. They realize, like, I'm out. Other folks wait until the marshals or the sheriffs come to put them out of their homes, and so that we chose that as the time. So this is just looking statewide at the numbers from 2019. And I'm sure this will speak to many of you who probably live in a lot of these jurisdictions. And 5% is the statewide percentage. Zooming into Richmond, we started to really dig deep. And Richmond, when the data came out in 2016 from the Princeton Eviction Lab, Richmond really, the numbers hadn't changed much from 2000 to 2016, and we haven't seen a great deal of change since then. But we had some areas where eviction rates were significantly higher than the citywide rate of 11%. And you see that here in this map, that you see some areas in the south side and the north side, particularly where the numbers are 2 times or even 3 times the citywide average, which is already higher, double the statewide average. And so we started to kind of think about, okay, so what's driving this? Because we see very clear patterns here of communities that have been consistently struggling with questions of food access, with questions of poverty, segregation, housing conditions. But we found when we analyzed these data, holding many things constant, you can kind of see them here, within the neighborhood level, neighborhood racial composition was the single biggest predictor, like double that of any of these other factors of neighborhood neighborhood eviction rate. And that really got us thinking and realized that, it's not necessarily that a landlord is looking at 2 tenants and saying, you're in, you're out. It's deeper than that, and it's actually quite structural. And that really got us to pause and think about what we were doing and why we were doing it. So this kind of digs into, we started looking at this as the pandemic began, and the dots are the number of COVID cases, and obviously the coloring of each area is eviction rate. And we found that as COVID kicked off, this was the same pattern that we saw with eviction in terms of racial composition, because these are ultimately driven by similar factors. They're driven by sort of historic disinvestment, and sort of historic limited access. So we see this kind of consistency when we came into the pandemic. Similarly, we saw a lot of overlap in terms of eviction rate, unemployment, and COVID cases. And we actually detailed this in a report in I think last summer that was requested by some of our community partners. But so where are we now, right? Because we've been through a year of pandemic. We've been through a year of courts closing and CDC protections and statewide protections. We've really kind of had a lot of churn. And so I think it's important to kind of ground us on where we are. So you'll see these are sort of quarterly eviction counts. We do a quarterly report we started doing again about this time last year. That again, this was part of what our community partners were asking for, was more frequent and predictable data. So that's what we started doing. And you'll see actually that the numbers have been down significantly, right? If you look at the first quarter of 2020, going January through March, right, the courts closed in mid-March. And that's where you see the second quarter, a significant decrease to almost nothing in the eviction space. In the third quarter, when the initial CARES Act was started to expire, the numbers ticked up again, particularly on the filing side. But they've been kind of on a steady decrease. Now, on the second quarter of 2021, we just updated these data. We saw that evictions are starting to increase slowly here, eviction filings particularly. And that is a little troubling from our perspective, and I suspect from those of you who are concerned about housing instability, because we know that we're still sort of in the middle of the pandemic for many folks, and our economy hasn't entirely recovered. And certainly those most impacted have not recovered. And then just looking at this and looking at the data another way, we look at this as a percentage of pre-COVID filings. So we sort of benchmarked 2019 and said, okay, so where are we relevant or related to 2019? And so you can see, even looking at the second quarter, we're starting to inch up around 26% of the pre-COVID filings for the second quarter of 2019. So, numbers are ticking up, but they aren't. We hear about an eviction tsunami. It's more of sort of an increase in stream right now, rather than sort of a massive cliff. And there are a few reasons for that, which I'll talk about later. But I would say that one of the biggest ones is that we have a significant rent relief program here in the state of Virginia. That was sort of brought on conveniently. I mentioned that all the sort of groundwork was laid before we even came into pandemic. Well, part of that groundwork was that the state had already started committing to a conversation about eviction, and had hired and developed an eviction section at the Department of Housing and Community Development. So when pandemic hit, they were actually ready to hit the ground running. And we had one of the first, if not the first, rent relief program in the country, stood up, really fronted with state dollars. And Virginia has spent down more of their federal money than any other state in the country. And that's really important. And that's, I would say that's part of what's keeping our numbers low, is because we're actually being able to start to make tenants whole earlier on. But we're not done yet. And this is from the Census Pulse survey. The census started this during the pandemic to kind of get a sense of where folks were on their rent payments. And so you can see where still more than a quarter of Virginia renters have no or slight confidence in their ability to pay next month's rents. The number of renters who are not caught up in rent payments has kind of gone on a slow decrease, which is very exciting. And again, part of that rent relief program. But I think this gives us a sense of that we're still in kind of an economic challenge right now. And this is actually even more telling, I would say, this is the percentage of renters who think they might be evicted within the next 2 months. This has gone down, obviously, from May, when we really started to see the end of the protections and the money hadn't quite moved all the way out on eviction prevention. But we're still up above 50% who really are feeling housing unstable of Virginia renters, right? And so, and while we can say, well, they're still in their homes, that is really important. The stress of feeling like you're housing unstable, especially for families, can be really debilitating. And so I think that, especially on top of the stress we're all feeling around pandemic and our health and safety. So I think this is also really an important piece, and it's definitely something we're watching over time, along with a few other indicators. This is, speaking of another indicator, right? We're looking at pending cases of evictions by region, as well as continuations. So a case may be continued, it may come in as an eviction case, and rather than making a judgment right there, the court will say, okay, well, we're continuing this until, particularly the most recent one, most common one right now, is until the rent relief dollars can move. And so we see actually the pending cases as perhaps the more telling indicator. And in Central Virginia, around Richmond and Hampton Roads, really 50% of the pending cases are in those two regions collectively. And that's really up from previous months that we've been looking at. And it's, again, it gives us a sense of that increasing stream versus a tsunami, right? We're not seeing everybody, all the landlords aren't rushing to the courthouse. And much of that is because of the rent relief, and the state requires landlords and tenants to apply for rent relief. So this is landlords to apply for rent relief before they can move through an eviction. So this is kind of important here. So, what have we done? And I mentioned a few things, but I think, again, it's important to talk about not just the things that happened in the immediate of pandemic, but these kind of longer term policy responses. And there are a few, the federal protections I mentioned, right? The CDC issued the moratorium or protections that make it much more difficult to evict, and particularly for those who are impacted by COVID directly. The CARES Act, which came in March very quickly after courts shut, made it so that those who had Fannie or Freddie loans, whether that was in a single family home or a multifamily home or had other federal support, were protected from foreclosure, which that meant that those who were rental properties were not able to evict because they could actually do forbearance on their mortgage. We were actually, because we were developing a building level database on evictions, we were able to run the very first in the country list of properties covered under the CARES Act for the city of Richmond, which was very helpful for a lot of our partners who were able to take that to the court, but also for those who were doing intake for services. And then, of course, the state has had several really strong protections, particularly closing the courts initially, and then requiring an application for rent relief. The second piece that was already in place coming through this was that our philanthropic community and the state had invested in significant legal assistance. We do not have a right to counsel, and we always need more counsel, but this was a really important step that had started in, I believe, 2019 to increase the number of attorneys who were supporting tenants and helping them understand their rights and negotiating and working through that. Related to this was the eviction diversion pilot program. The first part was started in the city of Richmond, and then there was a state program that was in a few jurisdictions, and then the rental assistance that I mentioned. And then I want to kind of give a shout out to one that's really forward thinking through the Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot Program, which is actually asking the question, what does our post-crisis policy look like? Which is really important for thinking about beyond just rental assistance, right? We understand that rent keeps people in their homes in the immediate moment, but that's not all that's going on in a family's life, and that's not all that we need to be thinking about. So we were able to map, we worked with DHCD to get data at the census tract level, and we were able to map this. This is jurisdiction level across the state of where rent relief was going. And so you can see the per household dollars. The darker colors were higher per household, and we'll zoom in just a moment to what that looks like. This largely follows the patterns of eviction across the state. So money is going where we would have expected it to go. I think one of the things to highlight here is that not all eviction shows up in the data. We see, particularly in areas that are not, that are a little less formal, we see a lot more informal evictions. We know from our point in time count a couple of years ago that while a quarter of those who are experiencing homelessness had been evicted in the previous year, 35% of those were evicted without a legal process. So it was, hey, you need to go, or something sort of pre-filing. And so we know that happened in the city of Richmond, where we have significant resources. We also know from talking to community-based organizations in places like Southwest Virginia that this is much more common there. And so a lot of the evictions do not show up in the data. And so that also speaks to some questions about connectivity and knowing about rights and resources. So the average rent relief per household is a percentage of median rent. We looked at that to try to normalize the data. So across the state, right, we're seeing people who are getting about 587% of the median rent, which means that they were behind by at least 5 months on average across the state. So this is pretty important to think about the real need. Folks are really waiting for this. It's important to think about in terms of looking forward. And those kind of questions about folks feeling unstable, right? If you're behind by 5 months, you're feeling pretty nervous about your future where you're living. Zooming in, this is the city of Richmond, Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield. Similar, we looked at that against eviction rates. So again, money is largely going where we would have anticipated based on rates before eviction or before the pandemic. The pandemic did not it actually, as we talked about initially, hit the hardest hit households hardest. So those who are already at risk of eviction and already having unstable employment, health issues that were causing unstable budgets, and other sorts of things, other risk factors for eviction, other things that were driving that. That's where the money is going. So zooming in was helpful. And even zooming into the zip code level, these were the zip codes where we actually saw rent relief going. We see two where the money was going the most, and that's related very clearly to filings in those jurisdictions or in those zip codes. So I'm going to end it there because I think there may be some good discussion. I'm seeing like 12 comments in the chat that I usually, with students, I can monitor this, but here I felt like I had to focus a little bit. So I look forward to the discussion, and I think Jill may have some questions to kick us off. Stop my sharing.
Thanks, Dr. Howell, for such a great presentation. It was really informative. I got a sneak peek, but it was good to have you put more contextualization to the slides. So I really appreciate that. So audience, we are switching now to the question and answer portion of our Lunch and Learn. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or chat function of Zoom. I am going to kick it off though. I really want to kind of follow more, look at the pandemic a little further. So since March 2020, given the pandemic, we've all experienced some level or degree of stress or unrest or trauma as individuals. We've seen it in communities and we've seen it in society. But at the same time, this lived experience, we keep hearing about or having conversations with each other about the period serving as a time to reflect and learn, right? So I'm curious on your perspective, Dr. Howell, on the lessons learned regarding eviction through the pandemic that we need to maintain post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think this is a great question because, and it's one that I know folks at the local government and the state government have been contemplating because, look, we've got to learn something from this. And I think for me, one of the biggest things is just the interconnected nature of the drivers of eviction, the drivers of unemployment and unstable jobs. These are all things, the health disparities, all of these things are actually very interconnected. It's not just like sort of one person gets evicted and a completely different person has asthma because they're living in poor quality housing, and a completely different person lives in a neighborhood without food access, and somebody else lives in a neighborhood that is unsafe due to violence. These are the same communities. And I think you can look backwards, right? As I'm a closet historian for urban history, but you can look backwards and see the same neighborhoods that were impacted by foreclosure in the early 2000, 2010 era are actually the same neighborhoods that are being impacted by eviction. And you're like, well, but foreclosure is home ownership. I don't understand how this is the case. Well, a lot of the sort of, we're seeing a good portion of eviction happening in single family rental homes that were foreclosed on in 2008, 2009, 2010, and bought up by larger scale investors. And then we're seeing evictions happen in those neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods were the same neighborhoods that were impacted by policies of redlining, urban renewal, and highway construction throughout history. So we see these kinds of patterns going through, and it's the same communities, both the same communities socially, but also the same communities geographically. And so I think there's a real lesson to learn here, and we often fail to learn the lesson. But I think that one of the big lessons is that we really have to think structurally. We can't just sort of keep doing these kinds of short spurt things that we say, oh, we fixed it this time, because we aren't actually fixing it. We're sort of putting a Band-Aid over something that's a whole body experience. So that's what I kind of hope we learn. And I think what's exciting to see, from the state level, quite frankly, is this conversation about a post-pandemic, post-crisis eviction policy. And that's not surprising, right? That's what they were thinking about, pre-pandemic. They were starting to think about it. The pandemic sort of derailed the ability to do larger policy thinking. So I'm looking forward to that possibility. I think the other thing is that, quite honestly, as we've been doing the math and doing the research, it's easier to do, it's easier and cheaper to do rent relief than it is to have people go into homelessness. Once you're dealing with homelessness, there are sort of a whole host of other challenges that families face at that point. And I think we're becoming very well aware of these interlocking housing and health impacts particularly, but also education, jobs, et cetera.
Thank you. You know, the other item that's come up is, you know, rightfully so, your presentation focused on looking at eviction crisis in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you know, and our lessons learned. But the questions, there's been a couple questions that are speaking to how does Virginia compare to the national trends on eviction and the other items related with policies and practice. So can you address how we as a state compare on the national level in terms of trends and rates, but also really want to understand from your perspective if the Commonwealth are viewed as leaders or followers when it comes to eviction policy? And, you know, if any examples that you can provide, that would be great too.
This is such an interesting, to me, it's an interesting conversation and a great question, because on rent relief, we are 100% leaders. You know, I've gotten calls from reporters who are asking like, wow, how did Virginia spend down its money? And I was like, well, we were ready to spend down our money, and we wanted to spend down our money. We had built the networks to do that because of having been alerted to, I mean, right, we were told, hey, there's a problem here. And we actually said, oh, wow, there's a problem here, and we're going to start to look at it. So on that, I would say that's sort of building of networks, building of relationships. We're starting to, the spending of the rent relief, I think we are absolutely a leader. I think that the numbers continue to bear out that we continue to be leaders in not a great way. And there are a few reasons for that, but we've talked about in various forums, but we don't have a particularly robust tenant protection at the state level. We don't have a particularly, I mean, our tenant organizing is really growing, but it is still fairly nascent. We've got some really strong folks who are really building power and building relationships with sort of state folks and trying to make sure that the lived experience at the community level is visible, and that we start to work on policies that really change that. But we really aren't a leader there. We also are not in the last place position. So I think that's also important. I think one of the things that happens in Virginia is, which puts us in a numbers leadership role, is that much of our evictions happen, as much as we have a lot that are happening off the books, a lot of our evictions happen through the court system. It's $58 to file an eviction in the state of Virginia, and other places it's like $300. You know, in combination with our limited tenant protections compared to other places, it means that a lot of our stuff comes through and it's very visible in our system. So it puts us in a leadership role from a numbers perspective. I would suspect that other places, you know, there's similar numbers if we were to put them all through the courts as well. That's my take, but I don't know if that's we obviously can't test that. But we know that a lot of our evictions happen through the courts.
Thank you. And so moving to another question, you know, in a presentation you provided different trends in eviction across the Commonwealth. So when we think about the state of Virginia, it's a diverse environment, right? No two communities are exactly the same. We have, as you've demonstrated, provided some new policies, or shall I say, innovative ways, or we're viewed as leaders in some areas regarding the eviction crisis. But how are statewide policies, which again, when they're formulated, are more one size fits all, so how are these statewide policies adapted based on the community conditions?
I think this is a big challenge, right? And I think one of the things that I feel like we don't necessarily talk about enough at VCU certainly, is the difference across the Commonwealth. I think we get very hung up on the 95 corridor and even out towards Hampton. But we don't necessarily talk about our colleagues and friends down in Southwest, which is a very different part of the state, south side of, again, very different part of the state. And I think, every place that we can also, every place is different, right? We can talk about Northern Virginia has significant local policy that is supporting, they've had rent relief and more emergency rental assistance, as well as local vouchers and other things that have helped keep people in place over time. And that's not the typical across the state. But we know that in some of our more rural communities, it's hard to let, like right now we find that it's hard to let people know you don't have to be evicted right now. You can apply for rent relief. Here are these resources. It's hard when there's limited broadband. So if our applications are largely online, you can do paper applications, but it's more complicated. If our sort of systems are built for an online system, but our broadband is not there, this creates challenges, right? This is not something we talk about in planning or policy school, at least logistics, but this is a really important piece of what we talk about. We also have to know that the eviction looks different in different places. Housing conditions look different, right? There's places where we're dealing with really deep conditions issues that are, we interview tenants and they're like, yeah, so I paid for this repair because my landlord wouldn't do it. But then, I couldn't take that off my rent because we didn't agree to it. And so the choice was like, do I live in poor conditions or do I repair it and potentially ding my budget? So we're seeing a lot of change. And I think that's one of the challenges is adapting. One of the interesting policy pieces that I mentioned, the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot Program, it's been talking to local community-based organizations who are working on this question, these kinds of locally adaptive policies and programs to try to see all of that. I think one of the things we probably need to really dig into are these informal evictions and other forms of housing displacement. We aren't necessarily talking about that, and that's not surprising. Most places aren't. But I think we need to start thinking about that because again, it's going to look different in a place like Northern Virginia where the market is really hot and you can raise the rent, and that moves people on without having to do an eviction process. Or you can not renew the lease, and that's not a formal eviction process, but there's so many people to keep churning through that are demanding housing that we have to think about the differences in market, the differences in geography, differences in access and population. And I think that's one of the things that policy struggles with.
So as a follow-up, a question came in from the audience about affordable housing programs and what might be the best or worst at adapting to an eviction crisis, right? So, I mean, you were addressing some of this by looking at the types of communities and how you have to adapt to what the conditions are. But do you have any programs that might be, that cure that we're all missing?
Oh, the magic silver bullet. I love
Yes.
that one. Yeah, unfortunately, right, eviction's more complicated than that. I think we have to think about the immediate and the long term. And this is because, right, people are in immediate crisis in eviction, right? You are about to lose your home. Your kids are about to lose their home, which is, I'd say for children is particularly destabilizing to, sometimes move into doubling up with other family and other things. Which also the other part about that is if you have an eviction on your record, that follows you around and you can be excluded from housing as a result of an eviction on your record. So it points to a few things, right? There's the emergency moment where we're like, okay, so how do we keep this family in this home? And so that's thinking about emergency rental assistance and making that more robust and more accessible. And I think, we've done that through the pandemic because of necessity, but it's been a tough haul, quite frankly, because our programs usually don't involve an agency, a tenant, and a landlord. And rent relief requires all three of those things, which makes it a little more complex than some other programs. And a lot of that was really based in the Treasury's requirements. So that's kind of if you think about the immediate, okay, we're in this crisis. And other things like eviction diversion, right? You're already in crisis, you come into the courthouse, and the eviction diversion program tries to keep people in housing by negotiating with the landlord to get rent paid and keep tenants in their home. And those things are happening. It's kind of like if you've got I always think about, you've got the water hose turned on, and that's like kind of bending the hose at the end just to keep the water from coming out all over your yard. Well, then there's other things we have to think about actually turning off the hose. And I think part of that, there's obviously some of that is a supply challenge, right? Getting housing that is affordable, affordable and run by really committed landlords to sort of improve the options for affordable housing, right? So if you, for example, if you come into an apartment and you're already paying 50% of your income for rent, because that was what was available, well, you might be able to do it most months. Your budget is, you did your budget and you said, okay, yes, I can afford this. But there's always that month where the car breaks down, your kid has to go to the doctor, there's a field trip, there's a school thing you have to pay for, or your hours get cut, because we know that particularly Black women tend to work in jobs that they've been relegated to jobs where the hours tend to get cut, and they get the worst shifts. And so if you're kind of dealing with that kind of budget instability, and then you're paying 50% of your income for rent, there's really not a lot of wiggle room. And so having a larger supply of affordable housing is a really critical piece of this. The other piece that we've seen has been really effective has been a right to counsel. In New York, that actually reduced filings of eviction. So that actually kept some of the filings by maybe perhaps folks who were not interested in having anyone to scrutinize the case too much from filing. And that's been fairly effective. And that does a couple of things, right? It helps in that moment of getting tenants to be able to get representation, which is obviously key, but it also helps tenants to understand their rights, which has been pretty key, pretty critical here. Other things like, just cause evictions, making sure folks can renew their leases automatically. That happens in a lot of jurisdictions, so that at the end of your term, the only reason you actually have to have a reason why your lease is not renewed. Whether it could very well be because the landlord's moving into that unit, but it can't just be because they wanted you out for some reason. So some of these kind of key protections actually keep that critically aware. Other sorts of ways on reducing speculation in buildings is also has been proven to reduce evictions. So actually making sure that buildings are maintained is really, really important. So these are just some of the ways, right? There's no silver bullet, unfortunately. This is bigger than us, bigger than this moment. It's a longer term historical piece. Obviously, things like job stability, so that people have protection in their work for their hours and things like that. Right, this digs deeper into these larger processes.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah, like
you provided some really good perspective and examples in individual situations that, explain the why adaptation needs to occur and creative thinking and innovation. So thank you. Okay, next question is long, not long, but it's longer than we've seen, right? So if you need me to repeat, please just ask. So from a data perspective, what statistically is an expected level of eviction filings? We know that there will be a percentage of households that will be late on rent, just like a percentage of households that are late on credit cards and car payments, similar to what you were talking about. But the audience member is really interested in understanding what a benchmark level is, and or is or isn't, and where is Richmond and other cities in comparison to that benchmark. So the question is really surrounding the expected level of eviction filings.
This is really interesting. Eviction filings versus eviction judgments, they're the first differentiation I would make. It's not surprising that someone would be filed on. I guess maybe the best way to say this is that the national rate is 3%. The rate in the west end of Richmond is less than 3%. It's sometimes in some tracts and communities, it's 1%. In some South Side neighborhoods in Richmond, it's 30%. So somewhere between 2% eviction rate and 30% eviction rate seems right to me. I mean, I don't think that actually, for me, I don't think there's an acceptable level of actual eviction. I think that that's something that we need to really think about, the root causes of why we are as a society accepting eviction, and having an acceptable rate of eviction. So, I mean, my goal would be to move towards no evictions, and that's not because I don't think landlords should be paid for rent. That's not what that means. What it does mean is that I think we as a society have to think bigger and deeper, because eviction has critical impacts on housing stability, and it kind of exacerbates the existing inequality that we have in society, right? So we're already sitting there with insecurity in food. We're sitting there with a range of different challenges, and eviction just kind of takes that and goes, right? It's just that much bigger, because families are housing insecure. So I think for me, I think about, let's not have an acceptable level of eviction. We know that it's gonna happen because families are gonna fall behind. We know that it's gonna happen because landlords are some landlords are not gonna be above board. We know that there are landlords for whom this is a sort of an operating model. This is not the case for all landlords. In fact, what we find in our research is that a very small number of landlords are contributing to a very large problem. And so, from my perspective, I think we have to kind of say, look, our goal is not to have an acceptable level of evictions. We know, again, nationally, the rate's 3%. This city, it's 11%. In some of our neighborhoods, it's 30% plus. So I guess that's a long-winded question to me, saying I don't think there is necessarily an acceptable level. We need to build on our security of housing, our security of income, because that's really the key equity issue moving forward.
So, in a related question, what accounts for the disparities in pending cases between Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads or Central Virginia? So can you talk a little bit further about the disparities in pending cases?
Yeah, so Northern Virginia has had actually, so I guess our big hotspots in the state coming into the pandemic were Central Virginia, the Hampton Roads region, and Northern Virginia to some extent. But Northern Virginia has always had a lower eviction rate, very much so, relative to the other two regions. And other than there are a few areas, right? The Route 1 corridor, Prince William County, particularly has that area has a higher eviction rate. And there are a few reasons for that. One, I think, one of the things I mentioned is that you can raise the rent, and you sort of move through an informal process that's forced move, but it's not a court level eviction. So that doesn't show up in our data. There are limitations to the data, and that's one of the limitations, one of the many. So the other piece is that they have a local rent support. So you can there's actually more resources there for keeping housing affordable. You also have a more significant tenant organizing infrastructure there that help people to understand their rights. So there's sort of a large there's sort of a lot of things going on. You also have got a lot of suburban areas with single family homeowners. So you don't have as many in some of the jurisdictions, you don't have as many rental properties, which and rental properties that they're there. Again, maybe single family homes, and so you don't have quite the density of that. But again, when you do sort of break it down jurisdictionally, you do see a high number, in particular the Route 1 corridor, and which is an area. So the impacted households there are immigrant populations and African American populations.
Thank you. The next question from audience is, in recognizing that the issue of eviction is historically systemic, what or where do you suggest the focus to create pathways for more home ownership or effective safety nets to the renters needs to begin? So
That's a
what
great
are
question.
pathways?
Yeah, so what are the pathways, right? So sometimes we immediately jump to homeownership as a way to stabilize housing, right? Because it's really, in the United States, but particularly in Virginia, it's really the only way to say I have control over this space. Homeownership is dicey and it's not for everyone. And it's not something that is necessarily productive, again, especially if you don't have a really stable income or you don't have an income that's got a lot of give in your budget. We've all had an emergency, or I haven't, I don't own a home, but many of us have had emergency water heater repairs or a roof that is leaking, and a roof can cost a lot of money. And so being able to maintain your home is really challenging. And so homeownership is not, I wouldn't jump to that as the answer to eviction. So the second part of the question really kind of gets to that, right? Which is that how do we build some safeguards around renter tenure, right? We have to think about renter tenure not as a temporary space, which is often how our policy thinks about it. It's sort of a stepping stone to homeownership that people make. Well, that happens for the middle class, you know, often. I think would say, with the exception of many large cities, you know, it's something, you know, you go to college, you get your first job, or this used to be the case. And I think, you know, as we've talked about, I met other forums have talked about the issue of student loan debt and the cost of living, et cetera, has made this so very hard. But, you know, you go to college, you get your job, you kind of go through your 20s, get married, you have kids, and you say, okay, it's time to buy a house. It's part of the sort of life process. But for many households, this is really not the case. You know, our homeownership rate in this country is 65%, give or take, depending on the time. And so that's actually a lot of folks who aren't owning homes, and we've remained fairly stable at that 65%, going up a couple percentage points during the housing boom in the 2005, 2006, and coming back down a few points in that post boom time. So it hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot. And so we're still talking about 35% of our population that is not a homeowner. And for many, it is a long-term, very important part of life. And so, like, I've interviewed folks who are in the same apartment unit for 42 years, or, you know, I've been in the same building for 29 years, and they've built community and they've built networks. And so all that's a long-winded thing to say. Jill's popping back up, and so it makes me wonder if I'm supposed to stop talking. But but all that to say is that we can build stable rental tenure. Many cities have done this, New York, DC, Chicago, other places. It's not an impossible thing, and Europe does it all the time. Rental tenure is a very normal space to be in. And so part of that is building in protections, things like being able to automatically renew your lease, thinking about what it is that you can be evicted for, what are the fees that are on top of your lease. So there's no real cap on fees, on late fees. And so that actually can really put you behind if you do miss rent. So people are going to miss rent occasionally. We talked about that, right? Budgets change. But if you've got a 10% fee on top of, or more on top of your rent, that tends to go to pay the fee for your next rent, pays the fee first, and then you still owe money on top of that rent, even if you paid the full rental amount. So things like that kind of create safeguards are really critical to this conversation, because rental tenure can be really key. We have a lot of people who fight to stay in their buildings. There's a reason why people fight to stay. It's because they've built community. It's because this is home for them. They've been there for, you know, the neighborhood perhaps for generations. They've been renters in the neighborhood for generations. What they want is somewhere stable that their kids can grow up and where they can age in place and be secure.
So we're going to have time for one, maybe two more questions, but you referenced your work with interviewing individuals over time, right? So this question focuses on qualitative information that you might be able to share. So the question is there qualitative data from the RVA Eviction Lab that underscores some of these challenges that are not necessarily the fault of the tenants?
Yeah, so we actually We do a lot of interviewing. We started out really thinking about interviewing as an important way of understanding the pathways to eviction. I mentioned limitations in the data and the quantitative data. Right, the quantitative data just shows you two things. Is it for late rent, or is it for something else? And you kind of don't really understand what happens within that. And I think so. We do a lot of interviewing for that. So what we often find, and also what we find with our partners, is a lot of issues around building conditions tend to ultimately drive evictions. That's something that is like consistent across the board. I did this repair because I had to. I lost my job. Some domestic violence situations created some challenges. People who just moved out of the unit and suddenly it wasn't tenable. So we have a range of things. Or hey, I got behind 1 month, and then the fees added on to my rent. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and I think it's interesting to think about fault of the tenant and what's the fault of larger issues. But I do think we do see a range of cases. Again, a lot of it's relating to building conditions, I would say, that tend to drive some of these issues. We have seen a lot where folks, are trying, one of the things that happens is if you do get an eviction on your record, it's harder to find housing the next time. And so the housing that you find is the housing that's has fewer standards in terms of it is fewer standards for a lot of things. And so that actually gets you into a situation that is often even more unstable. So it's a pretty awful cycle in terms of evictions for families.
Well, that is going to conclude our question and answer session, given the time. The hour has flown by. I want to begin by just saying thank you to you, Dr. Howell, for providing insights onto this important issue. You provided some trends on eviction rates across the Commonwealth compared nationally, some of our mitigation policies and programs regarding the eviction crisis. And it's clear we still have a long way to go. But I'm also glad to see the Commonwealth is leader in some of the areas. I'm also hopeful that as a state we'll continue to look for equitable solutions across communities and the diversity of our communities. So I also want to thank everybody who's joined us today. You've been delightful, engaging. I wish I could have gotten to all your questions, but time did not permit. And I hope to see you next Thursday at our next event, which is our Wilder Symposium on the Triple Pandemic. I'm now going to turn the mic over to our Director of Development and Alumni Engagement, Stephen Dozier.
Yes, thank you, Jill. Thank you to Dr. Howell. Thank you to Dr. Gooden as well, and all our participants for creating such a thought-provoking discussion this afternoon. As Dr. Gordon just reminded us, next week we'll have the 2021 Wilder Symposium, the Triple Pandemic Implications for Racial Equity and Public Policy. We hope you can join us, and you see the RSVP link there. And then on October 20th at 12, we'll have our next installment of the Lunch and Learn series, 20 years after 9/11, Are We Safe? With Ambassador Jim Gilmore III, our former governor of Virginia. Again, thank you all for joining us. Special thank you to our communications team for all their work behind the scenes. And we hope to see you again next week in October. Have a great week.